The thunder of aircraft engines tore through the dawn sky like the gates of hell splitting open. I pressed my face into the coral sand as the first Japanese bombs exploded across Wake Island's airfield, the concussions hammering my chest like sledgehammers. December 8, 1941, barely 12 hours after Pearl Harbor, and now they were coming for us. My name is Major James Patrick Sean Devereux, United States Marine Corps, commanding officer of the 1st Defense Battalion Detachment on Wake Island. As I lifted my head from the debris-strewn ground, watching our precious Grumman F4F Wildcats disappearing in balls of orange flame, I knew with crystalline certainty that my 449 Marines were about to write their names in blood across this godforsaken speck of coral in the middle of nowhere. 3 weeks earlier, Wake Island had seemed like just another routine assignment in paradise. This tiny atoll, really 3 small islands connected by causeways, shaped like a wishbone, sat 2,300 miles west of Hawaii in the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific. Peacock Point, Wilkes Island, and Wake proper formed a natural lagoon that the Navy wanted as a seaplane base and forward refueling station. When I'd arrived on October 15th with my Marines, Wake was crawling with civilian contractors from Morrison-Knudsen Corporation. Over 1,100 workers were rushing to complete the airfield and fortifications before whatever was coming. The signs were everywhere: increased patrols, hurried construction, and that electric tension you feel when brass starts talking in hushed voices. My Marines were good men, mostly young and untested, but eager. We had the 1st Defense Battalion's detachment, about 450 Marines including myself, equipped with coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and small arms. Our heavy weapons included 6 5-inch naval guns, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 18 50 caliber machine guns, scattered around the atoll's 15-mile perimeter. The Navy had Marine Fighting Squadron 211 stationed here too, under Major Paul Putnam. His dozen F4F Wildcats were our air cover, our only air cover. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham, USN, was the overall island commander, but the defense preparations fell largely to me and my Marines. By early December, we'd managed to get most of our positions dug in. The coral was hell to work with, harder than concrete in some places, but we'd carved out gun emplacements, command posts, and ammunition bunkers. The civilian workers had nearly finished the airfield, and we were finally starting to look like a real military installation. Then came December 7th. The radio chatter from Pearl Harbor that Sunday evening painted a picture so devastating it seemed impossible. The Pacific Fleet crippled, battleships burning, thousands dead. As we huddled around our communications equipment in the sweltering night air, listening to fragmentary reports crackling through the static, one thing became crystal clear: Wake Island was now completely on its own, a tiny outpost dangling at the end of a very long, very vulnerable supply line. I spent that night walking the perimeter, checking positions, talking to my Marines. The joking and horsing around had stopped. In their young faces, I saw the same realization dawning that had hit me. We were no longer preparing for a possible war. We were preparing for a siege. At 0700 hours on December 8th, our radio operator picked up Japanese voices on the airwaves. 30 minutes later, lookouts spotted aircraft approaching from the south, 36 twin-engine Mitsubishi G3M Nell bombers, flying in perfect formation against the brilliant blue morning sky. All hands. Air raid, this is no drill. My voice echoed across the island as Marines scattered to battle stations. The Wildcats scrambled. 8 of them managed to get airborne before the bombs started falling. What followed was 25 minutes of pure hell. The Japanese had done their homework. Their bombs concentrated on the airfield, the Pan American Airways facilities, and our suspected gun positions. Explosions marched across Wake like the footsteps of giants. Coral and debris geysered skyward. Buildings disintegrated. Men screamed. When the smoke cleared, we'd lost 8 of our precious Wildcats on the ground. Worse, we'd lost good Marines, 10 killed, 12 wounded in that first attack. Among the dead was aviation machinist, mate First Class Robert Markowitz, a Navy man attached to VMF 211 who'd stayed at his post trying to save aircraft until the bombs found him. But we weren't helpless. Captain Henry Elrod, flying one of the 4 remaining Wildcats, shot down 2 of the retreating bombers before they could reach safety. The Marines on the ground watched those Japanese planes spiral into the ocean trailing smoke and fire, and let out a cheer that could be heard across the lagoon. That evening, as I surveyed the damage and counted our losses, I knew this was just the beginning. The Japanese had found us, they'd tested our defenses, and they'd be back. They came back the next day, and the day after that. And every day for the next 3 days, the same routine. Japanese bombers appearing on the horizon like clockwork, our handful of remaining Wildcats rising to meet them, bombs falling, coral flying, Marines dying. By December 11th, we were down to just 4 operational F4Fs. Major Putnam worked miracles keeping them flying, cannibalizing parts from wrecked aircraft, and his pilots, Elrod, Davidson, Kinney, and Hamilton, flew mission after mission despite exhaustion and overwhelming odds. The Japanese bombers weren't our only visitors. Our coast watchers reported ships on the horizon, warships, moving in formation. Intelligence estimates suggested a full invasion force was gathering somewhere to our south. On the evening of December 10th, I gathered my staff in the command bunker we'd carved out of the coral near the airfield. The concrete walls sweated in the humid air, and our single electric bulb cast harsh shadows across the faces of exhausted Marines. "Gentlemen," I said, spreading our hand-drawn defense maps across the makeshift table, "we all know what's coming. The Japanese are going to try to take this island. Our job is to make them pay such a price that they'll think twice about their next target." Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, my executive officer, nodded grimly. "What's our ammunition situation? We've got plenty of small arms ammo, but we're getting low on 5-inch shells for the coastal guns. Maybe 30 rounds per gun. We need to make every shot count." Captain Wesley Platt, commanding our Battery A, leaned forward. "What about air support? Any word from Pearl?" I shook my head. "Pearl's in no condition to help anybody right now. Task Force 14 is supposedly en route with the carrier Saratoga, but they're days away at best. We're on our own." The silence stretched out like a held breath. These men had families, futures, dreams beyond this coral speck in the middle of nowhere. But not one of them suggested surrender or evacuation. They were Marines. "All right then," I said finally, "we dig in deeper. We conserve ammunition, and when they come, we kill as many as we can." Dawn on December 11th broke clear and beautiful, with trade winds stirring the palm fronds and the lagoon sparkling like scattered diamonds. By 0300 hours, our radar operator reported surface contacts approaching from the south, a lot of them. Through binoculars from my observation post, I could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese warships emerging from the morning haze. 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and behind them, the squat shapes of transport ships loaded with invasion troops. The invasion force had arrived. At 0500 hours, the lead cruiser, later identified as the Yubari, opened fire. The first salvo of 5.5-inch shells screamed overhead and exploded in the lagoon, sending geysers of water and coral fragments skyward. More shells followed, walking steadily toward our gun positions. "Battery A, this is Devereux," I spoke into the field telephone. "Enemy cruisers bearing 180 degrees, range approximately 4,000 yards. You are cleared to engage." Captain Platt's voice crackled back, "Roger." "Battery A engaging." The first shot from our 5-inch gun at Peacock Point roared across the water like the voice of God. I watched the splash through my binoculars, short, but close. The second shot struck the Yubari amidships, and even at that distance, I could see the flash of the explosion and the gout of smoke that erupted from her superstructure. What followed was the most intense naval engagement I'd ever witnessed. Our 6 5-inch guns, scattered around the atoll's perimeter, engaged the Japanese ships in a deadly game of long-range dueling. The enemy vessels maneuvered frantically, laying smoke and returning fire, but our Marines had trained well. We scored hit after hit. Captain Elrod's Wildcat appeared overhead, diving on the Japanese destroyers with guns blazing. I watched in amazement as he made repeated strafing runs, his .50 caliber bullets sparking off steel decks and superstructures. On his final pass, he dropped a small bomb that struck the destroyer Kisaragi directly in her depth-charge storage. The explosion was tremendous, a pillar of fire and smoke that rose 1,000 feet into the air. When it cleared, the Kisaragi was gone, completely vaporized along with her crew of 157 men. By 0700 hours, the Japanese had had enough. The surviving ships turned away, trailing smoke and listing from our hits. As they disappeared over the horizon, a cheer went up from Marines all around the atoll. We'd actually beaten off an invasion force. But the celebration was short-lived. Our ammunition expenditure had been enormous. We were now down to just a few rounds per gun. And through intercepted radio traffic, we learned that the Japanese were already organizing a second, larger invasion attempt. The next week passed in a haze of constant bombing attacks and frantic preparation. The Japanese, stung by their repulse on December 11th, were taking no chances with their second attempt. Intelligence reports suggested they were assembling an overwhelming force, more cruisers, more destroyers, more transports, and worst of all, aircraft carriers to provide air cover. Our situation grew more desperate by the day. We were down to 2 operational Wildcats. Our ammunition was critically low. Most of our heavy equipment had been destroyed or damaged by bombing. The civilian workers had been pressed into service as stretcher bearers and ammunition handlers, brave men who'd signed up to build an airfield but were now fighting for their lives alongside Marines. On December 20th, Captain Elrod was killed when his Wildcat was shot down during a bombing attack. I'd watched that man perform miracles in the air, shooting down Japanese planes and bombing ships with a courage that bordered on the supernatural. His loss was a blow to morale that rippled through the entire garrison. The same day, we received a message from Pearl Harbor that hit like a physical blow. Task Force 14, our only hope of relief, had been recalled. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had been relieved of command, and his replacement wasn't willing to risk the carrier Saratoga in what looked like a hopeless rescue mission. We were truly alone now. I gathered my remaining officers that evening in the ruins of our command post. The concrete bunker had taken several direct hits, and we were meeting by candlelight in what remained of the structure. "Gentlemen," I said, "I'm not going to lie to you. The situation is grim. No relief is coming. Our ammunition is nearly exhausted. We have perhaps 24 men still capable of sustained combat." Lieutenant Robert Hanna, one of our youngest officers, spoke up. "What are our orders, sir?" I looked around at these exhausted, dirty, but still defiant faces. "Our orders are to hold this island as long as humanly possible. To make the Japanese pay for every yard of coral. And to die like Marines if it comes to that." The end began at 0200 hours on December 23rd. Through the darkness came the rumble of ship engines, many ship engines. The Japanese had returned with a vengeance. 6 cruisers, 8 destroyers, 2 aircraft carriers, and a dozen transports carrying over 2,000 assault troops. This time there would be no repulsing them. The bombardment that preceded the landing was unlike anything we'd experienced. For 2 solid hours, Japanese naval guns poured shells into every known position on the atoll. The few remaining buildings were pulverized. Our carefully prepared defensive positions were smashed. The airfield, cratered and re-cratered by days of bombing, disappeared entirely under a carpet of explosions. When the barrage finally lifted, landing craft were already heading for shore at 3 different points. In the pre-dawn darkness, we could see the phosphorescent wakes spreading across the lagoon like fingers of death reaching for us. All units, this is Devereux. I called over our battered radio network. Enemy landing in progress. Engage at will. Make every shot count. What followed was less a battle than a series of desperate last stands. Our scattered Marines, many wounded, armed with whatever weapons they could find, fought from shell holes and rubble piles as hundreds of Japanese troops swarmed ashore. At Battery L on Wilkes Island, Gunner Clarence McKinstry and his men held out for 3 hours against overwhelming odds, firing their anti-aircraft guns point-blank into advancing infantry. When their ammunition ran out, they fought with rifles, then pistols, then bayonets and rifle butts. On Peacock Point, Sergeant Henry Elrod and a handful of Marines made their last stand around the ruins of the 5-inch gun emplacement, selling their lives as dearly as possible before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Everywhere across Wake, small groups of Marines fought isolated actions against vastly superior forces. They died hard, those Marines, taking Japanese soldiers with them, making the enemy pay for every position, every yard of coral, every breath of life. As dawn broke on December 23rd, it became clear that organized resistance was crumbling. We'd been reduced to scattered pockets of a few men each, cut off from communication, running out of ammunition, facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reinforcements. At 0800 hours, standing in the ruins of our command post with perhaps a dozen Marines still capable of fighting, I faced the hardest decision of my military career. We could fight to the last man, and that last man would die within the hour. Or I could surrender and save the lives of the wounded and the civilian workers who'd fought beside us. Lieutenant Hanna, blood streaming from a shrapnel wound on his forehead, looked at me with hollow eyes. "Your orders, Major." I looked out across Wake Island, or what remained of it. The once beautiful atoll looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and blasted, littered with the wreckage of aircraft, vehicles, and buildings. Bodies lay everywhere, American and Japanese alike, scattered across coral that had been stained red with their blood. We'd held for 15 days. We'd sunk 2 destroyers, damaged 8 other warships, and shot down 21 aircraft. We'd killed over 800 Japanese soldiers and sailors. We'd shown the world that Americans could fight, and fight hard. But it was over. "Destroy all remaining weapons and equipment," I said quietly. "Burn the code books. We're going to surrender." The white flag went up at 11:30 hours on December 23, 1941. As Japan's troops swarmed into our positions, I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming sadness for the men we'd lost. The Japanese commander, Captain Shigematsu Sakabara, was surprisingly correct in his treatment of the surrender. Perhaps he respected what we'd accomplished, or perhaps he was simply too tired from his own heavy losses to indulge in theatrics. The final butcher's bill was sobering. Of the 449 Marines who defended Wake Island, 49 were killed and 32 wounded. We'd also lost 70 Navy personnel and 82 civilian contractors. The Japanese, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, had suffered far worse. Over 800 dead, 300 wounded, 2 destroyers sunk, 8 ships damaged, and 21 aircraft destroyed. But statistics couldn't measure the real cost or the real victory. In those 15 days, Wake Island became a symbol of American determination and courage. When the American people needed heroes, we'd given them heroes. When they needed proof that this war could be won, we provided that proof by showing that Americans could inflict devastating casualties on the supposedly invincible Japanese military machine. The civilian workers, Dan Teeters, Forrest Reed, Eric Latola, and dozens of others, had fought alongside Marines with a courage that defied belief. These men had signed contracts to build an airfield, but when the time came, they'd picked up rifles and fought for America with the dedication of professional soldiers. Major Paul Putnam and his pilots had written their own chapter in the annals of Marine Corps aviation. With a handful of obsolete fighters, they'd held off vastly superior air forces and provided close support that was nothing short of miraculous. Captain Henry Elrod's posthumous Medal of Honor was richly deserved. The man had personally sunk a destroyer with a tiny fighter plane. Aussie write this account decades later. I'm often asked whether we could have done anything differently. Could we have held out longer? Could we have been better prepared? Should we have tried to evacuate before the final assault? The answer to all those questions is probably yes. War is full of might-have-beens and if-onlys. But I've come to believe that what we accomplished on Wake Island was exactly what America needed at that moment in history. In December 1941, the United States was reeling from Pearl Harbor. The Philippines were falling. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, their military machine rolling across the Pacific like an avalanche. Americans were beginning to wonder if we had the will and the skill to fight a modern war against such a determined enemy. Wake Island answered that question. A tiny garrison of Marines and sailors, outnumbered 10-1, had held off the Japanese Empire for over 2 weeks. We'd inflicted casualties that the enemy would remember for the rest of the war. We'd shown the world that Americans would fight for every inch of ground, that we wouldn't surrender easily, and that victory over the United States would come at a price that might ultimately prove too high to pay. The men who died on Wake Island, Marines like Private Wiley Sloman and Corporal Ralph Halowinski, sailors like Robert Markowitz, civilians like Bright Godbold, didn't die in vain. Their sacrifice helped kindle the fighting spirit that would carry America through 4 long years of war to ultimate victory. We held the line when the line needed holding. We bought time when time was precious. We showed courage when courage was what the world needed to see. In the end, that's what Marines do. We hold the line. No matter the odds, no matter the cost, no matter how impossible the situation appears. We hold the line until relieved or until there's no line left to hold. Wake Island fell on December 23, 1941. But in falling, it rose to become something greater than just a military defeat. It became a symbol of American determination, a proof of concept that would echo through Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and every other bloody yard of coral and sand we'd fight for across the Pacific. The Alamo of the Pacific, they called us, and like the Alamo, our defeat became a rallying cry for victory. We held the line. That's what Marines do.